Hi, welcome to my presentation on accessibility in online courses. My name is Travis Lee. I'm an instructional designer with the UC Online project. And today I'm going to speak to you about accessibility. It's mainly going to focus on accessibility design for instructional designers. So this may be more helpful for developers and designers, but I still think this will be valuable information for anyone looking at accessibility from a design point of view or in education in general. Here we have the learning outcomes for this talk. I'm going to break it up into two sections. We're going to start by defining accessibility in online content, understand why we need accessibility beyond just legal reasons, define the ADA 504, 508, and WCAG 2.0 guidelines. Then I'm going to move on to best practices for instructional designers and how to design accessible online content from a very high level. I'm going to go on to discuss the tools of accessibility, and I'm going to conclude with how to contact your students through the syllabus, contact your students with disabilities through the syllabus. All right, so I'm going to start with what is accessibility. We really need to think about accessibility in two ways. There's the user experience and the developer experience. For the users, is how users with disabilities access electronic information. So their challenge is to identify the tools that provide the most convenient access to web-based and electronic information. For example, a blind user may be using a screen reader to navigate through the site and to read the content on a page. For the developer, his or her responsibility is to design web pages that are relatively simple to overcome these obstacles. Try not to create web pages that prevent these accessibility tools from working. In most cases, the challenges are relatively simple to overcome, but sometimes the solution may require a little bit more thought and effort. So you should think about accessibility from both the designer and user experience. I'm going to speak a little bit why we need accessibility. Here's a little bit of stats that I gathered from the census in 2000. So it's a little bit out of date, but I have reviewed some other sites, and it seems to be about accurate as of 2016. All right, so about 49.7 million Americans, nearly 1 in 5, are now considered disabled. Think about that when you're designing. So we're really looking at an aging population, which is relatively, the United States population in general is aging. So that might contribute to the 1 in 5 or the 50 million people who are disabled. And that number is actually growing right now. I also want you to think about the internet users in general. So we have 13 million internet users in America who are using assistive devices such as a head or foot mouse, which are for users who don't have use of their hands or arms. We have a puff and sip switch, which is another way to navigate online for users who don't have use of their hands or legs or feet. So they actually use something that goes into their mouth and they're able to navigate using puffs of air. We have speech recognition and screen reading software. That's something that a lot of blind or low vision people use, and also screen magnifiers for low vision users. So I really do want to emphasize that we're not talking about an obscure population. We're really talking about a very significant fraction of the US population here. All right, so I want to move on to something that's a little bit more relevant to designing online courses for college students. So I'm going to start with this. According to the US Department of Education, there's about 11 million students who have, 11% of college students rather are disabled. So about 1 in 10 students are disabled. As you can see here, a vast majority of them are actually having learning disabilities, ADHD, and other emotional issues or learning disabilities. So the majority of the students, we're not talking about low vision or deaf. We're actually talking about people who have learning differences or some sort of psychological or emotional disorder. All right, so as you can see, learning disabilities make up 31%. That's the biggest fraction of the disabled students. ADD, ADHD, which is really a lot more common than it was a few years ago because of the diagnosis that have been given out over the last 10 years, starting in elementary school oftentimes. Physical health conditions is 18%. That could be any number of things. Mental or psychiatric conditions are 15%. Difficulty hearing or seeing is only 7%, and other is 11%. So when we do talk, when I speak on this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about screen readers, but we also should really think about people with learning disabilities and people who have emotional issues. So I think that we should really emphasize that online education is a good option for people who have social anxiety disorder or other social issues which prohibit them from showing up in the classroom and behaving and having a good experience in a social learning environment. All right, I'm going to move on to some of the acts and laws around disability and online education. I'm going to start with the ADA. So oftentimes you go to conferences and you hear people throwing around these terms. I'm going to let you know exactly where these terms come from and what these laws are. So the biggest one is the ADA, American with Disabilities Act. It was enacted in 1990 by George Bush, #1, and it went into law in 1992. It's essentially an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made discrimination based on race, religion, sex, national origin, or other characteristics illegal. So they extended those same rights onto people with disabilities, and that makes a lot of sense. But it needed to be put into law. It's a federal law, so which is why in the 1990s you might have seen a lot of elevators or wheelchair ramps and curb cutouts being implemented throughout this nation within the infrastructure. So that's an important law to think about. But when someone says it's ADA compliant, it's really not giving us very much information. When you're working with a third-party vendor, they say, oh yeah, we're ADA compliant. That really doesn't give us like, oh, specifically, are you following WCAG 2.0 guidelines? So ADA is a very high umbrella, and it's not specific, but just know that the ADA applies to everything in this nation, including private sector businesses. We now move on to Amendments 508 and 504. These are actually similar to the ADA. They're extensions of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So the ADA is an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 508 and 504 are amendments to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Those were also giving rights to minorities and people who needed protections during that time. The 60s and 70s were a time of civil rights, and the Supreme Court was a relatively liberal one, and it was enacting these laws. So, but the 508 and 504 are specific to agencies that are getting federal funding or government funding. So that would apply to the UC system, for example. So 508, just know, is specific to agencies that receive federal funds. And 504 is very similar, except it covers all agencies, and it has specific protections of children with disabilities to receive equal education. That's important to know. There's that distinction in there. And 508 has different levels of accessibility. For example, level 508 single A is less than 508 double A, and there's 508 AAA level of compliance. AAA being the highest level of compliance, and I would say most businesses are at 508 single A compliance. I mean, they're just really scratching the surface of what it means to be truly accessible. The UC accessibility policy is pushing towards 508 AA compliance, and I'll go over that a little bit later in the presentation. All right, so here we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0, also known as WCAG. These are the principles that I'm going to go over. It's a long document. It was outlined by the WC3, the Worldwide Consortium, which implements and maintains the international standards for the internet. It's a pretty long document, but here we have, I've distilled it down to this 4 principles. And this is to achieve 508 compliance. I mean, these are the principles that lead to 508 AA, AAA compliance. All right, So principle number one, content must be perceivable. All right, so when you think about that, we are really talking about on a web page, we're allowing blind users, for example, to know what an image looks like. So that includes alt text. So inside of an image text or image HTML tag, you have image source equals, and you also have alt equals, and that is where you could give a description. For example, if there's a picture in a website or a news article of the winning dog for the Westminster Dog Show, and it would be fine just to put alt text equals dog, but it would be better to put alt text equals winning dog of the Westminster Dog Show, Rex, the poodle. And that will give the blind user a little bit more information about what he or she could be looking at, but it will give them context for the article as well. Content must be perceivable also implies that we need to have alternatives to timed sessions. For example, if there is a video only option, if you have a lecture that's only video, there should also be a transcription available to the user. Or if it's audio only, there should also be a transcription. So there needs to be some alternatives to that for people who have learning differences. Perceivable also means that the foreground color and background color have enough contrast. So for people who have color blindness, which affects men, I think 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 men have color blindness. Red-green color blindness is a common one. But oftentimes, they can't tell the difference between these two colors, but they could tell the difference if you bring it down to a grayscale, meaning black and white image. Is that contrast enough to make those letters pop out? And that is something to think about in principle number one, content must be perceivable. All right, principle number two, interface elements in the content must be operable. All right, so this really talks about keyboard functionality, for example, keyboard-only function. So a lot of blind users use tab browsing or keyboard browsing, and so you're able to navigate on the site without a mouse. That's an example of the content being operable. Another example, this principle also covers blinking objects on a screen that may cause seizures. That's actually in the writing there. You should know about like a GIF animation or some sort of video animation that could cause seizures. That's also covered in principle number two. Interface elements in the content must be operable. So think about how the person's going to navigate through the site. All right, so principle number three, content and controls must be understandable. This is about making sure that the content on the web page you're able to use different tools of accessibility with this content. For example, oftentimes I see faculty, they'll scan a document and PDF it and upload it. Oftentimes that is just an image. You'll know that it's just an image if you try to highlight the text and the text is not highlightable. That means it's not OCR. OCR meaning object character recognition. So OCR means that you could actually highlight the text. That's an important principle under principle number three. So when you do create a PDF or a Word document, make sure that it's OCR. I'll talk a little bit later about how to make things OCR. All right, and this also applies to making web page operate in predictable ways, meaning that it's that links are going to link to the correct places, the navigation elements are going to go to the correct places, and the interface is going to be clickable in using these different web technology for assisted accessibility. All right, principle number four, content must be robust enough to work with current and future technologies. This really talks about maximizing the compatibility with different operating systems and different web browsers. You should also think about tools in the past, such as Flash. Flash is not accessible, especially you should not be designing a Flash because it are not going to be available using current technology such as iPads. That's something to think about. And when you're designing, think about what could be the next steps in technology. And hopefully you'll be designing in such a way that is going to be compatible with web browsers of the future, and HTML5 is an example of an alternative to animation that is accessible. All right, so these are the Web Content Guidelines WCAG 2.0. It covers a wide range of recommendations, but I broke it down into those 4 principles. I hope this is going to be enough to get you started on WCAG 2.0. You can look it up. There's a lot of documentation, but I really narrowed it down to just 4 principles that are recommended to reach 508 AA, AAA compliance. If you hit all of them correctly, you'll be AAA compliant. Most of the times it's not completely compliant with the AAA standards. I'm going to take a break now, and we're going to move on after this to the best practices for instructional designers to use to build accessible online content.